Welcome back to the Politics and Media programme. The government's controversial workfare scheme received a major blow from an appeal court ruling last week. The court said that Tory Minister Ian Duncan-Smith has exceeded his powers in forcing an unemployed graduate to work in a Poundland store under threat of having her benefits removed. Many such government schemes may now have to be rethought or abandoned. The judges, however, refused to describe the schemes as forced labour, but many other critics have said as much. So should these so-called back-to-work programmes now be abandoned altogether? This report has more.
Now at 40 and counting, the British government has had to make yet another U-turn, this time on their workfare scheme, which the UK High Court deemed to be illegal. The scheme had already caused considerable controversy, for it meant that job seekers' allowance receivers would have to perform unpaid work, else have their benefits stopped. The work was not matched to skill sets and experience, and so, in a real-life example, a geology graduate who wanted to work in a museum found herself stacking cans of food in Poundland. The government has long argued that working anywhere can go a long way towards securing long-term employment. The scheme's detractors, however, have compared it to slavery and counterproductive at decreasing unemployment. However, claims of slavery were dismissed by the High Court. Rather, it ruled on simple nuts and bolts. One claimant was told that the scheme was mandatory. The court ruled that it was not. Another was told he would lose his benefits if he did not attend a 6-month work experience program. The court ruled that he could only lose a maximum of 2 weeks' benefits. Furthermore, people who have had their benefits stopped on these grounds can now claim the money back. This scheme has already taken a battering, with major high street chains such as Maplin, Waterstones and Sainsbury's pulling out last year. But with the government planning to appeal the verdict and try to push on with the scheme, it remains to be seen whether this scheme will actually help people get into permanent employment. Amanda Thomas-Johnson, Islam Channel.
With me in the studio are Deven Ghelani, Director of Policy and Practice, and Andrew Fisher from the Public Commercial and Services Union. And on the phone we have Pierre Lapin, Executive Member of the Boycott Workfare Network. Welcome to the programme, everybody. Okay. So, Deven, this is a scheme that's in a total mess now, isn't it? I mean, the High Court's ruled that the practice of the scheme is not working and major companies have pulled out of it.
Well, there are two different schemes to be talked about here. One is the mandatory work scheme, which I think is often confused with work experience. Now, I've spoken to employers up and down the country while looking at how people get into jobs, and actually it's quite clear that one thing employers want when they're looking for someone to take a role is work experience. And unfortunately, quite a lot of young people who are struggling desperately want to show an employer what they can do. And what the government's trying to do with some of these work experience schemes is for those that are struggling to arrange their own placements, give them a placement so that they can start to show an employer what they're capable of.
Andrew, I mean, but in this case, I mean, the graduate that was referred to in one of these cases was a geology graduate who was volunteering in a museum and then gets sent off to Poundland. I mean, well, there's something wrong with this picture, as they say.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, Kate Riley was, as you say, a geology graduate. She was volunteering in a museum, having had a paid placement in a museum before, in the same museum before that. And she went from volunteering in a museum, which is relevant to her skills, to basically volunteering in Poundland unwillingly. And she was told it was mandatory. Actually, she shouldn't have been told that, which is what the court ruling said. Obviously, potentially, if the DWP fails in its appeal, she will be entitled to compensation along with thousands of others who have been treated similarly. So, work experience is a good thing. Nobody's disputing that. What the problem with it is that it should be optional, and frankly, it should be paid. You know, there's no reason for the British welfare state to be subsidising Poundland. It's a profitable company. If there are shelves to be stacked, they can afford to pay people to do that. Really, this should be a paid scheme. I've got no problem with work experience scheme, but especially if we're talking about 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 6 months in some cases, some of these schemes on the mandatory end, they should be paid.
Pierre, let me bring you into discussion now. I mean, how widespread do you think these cases are? We've heard about 2, the High Court's ruled on them, but do you think that this is a common practice in the schemes?
It's a very common practice in the scheme. According to Newsnight last week, over 800,000 people are either on the scheme at the moment or have been. I'm not sure quite what the figure was because they just said 800,000. And also, Deven, I'm afraid it's called mandatory work activity, and as far as I understand it, that is for basically naughty job seekers that don't fulfil the requirements of the programme, including turning up to interviews or appointments, or actually applying for jobs or looking for jobs. So basically, when it comes down to it, I think you ought to understand that it's mandatory work activity.
So Deven, what about the principle here, which Pierre is raising there? Do you think that people actually ought to be mandatorily obliged to do work?
Well, mandatory work activity in the UK doesn't actually apply until you've been unemployed for at least a year. Now, I think in some cases these schemes can be useful to advisors. For example, if you've had someone who's been long-term unemployed and is actually, frankly, really scared of going back into the jobs market, well, sometimes saying to them, well, give it a go, isn't necessarily an unreasonable thing to ask for if you've been unemployed for 2 years or something like that. Spending 4 weeks actually in a job, it's not necessarily that much to ask, I don't think. And actually, sometimes that can be the jolt that some people need to make them realise, well, actually, this is better than being at home stuck on benefits. Work is actually quite a good thing for people's mental well-being as well as their financial.
I mean, Andrew, nobody's got an argument with that, no doubt. But forcing people by law?
I think that's the issue. I think it presupposes that people don't have their own best interests at heart. I mean, nobody sits at home on £71 a week, or for the million young people who are unemployed, £56.25 a week, thinking this is the life of Riley, this is how I want to live the rest of my life. People want to work. The reality is, if you look at it, there are 500,000 vacancies, in fact just under, in the British economy, and 2.5 million people unemployed. Now, that's before you get into people who are working part-time who want a permanent job, people who are already in work who change jobs, which a number of those vacancies will be taken by. It's just a natural churn, if you like. There just aren't the jobs out there, and that isn't going to be solved by putting people into Poundland or putting people on community action programmes or anything like that. The real obligation, I think, on the government, and this is where I think it's evading its responsibility, is to actually create jobs, which it's failing to do, really.
I mean, definitely, isn't that the problem? I mean, part of the problem, at any rate, with the way in which this question is addressed politically, is it transmits the message, and it's hard to think that the government doesn't want to transmit this message, that the essential fault with the unemployed is that they're not prepared to look for work. And to believe that, you would have to believe that at some point after 2008, 2.5 million people suddenly got lazier in this country, and it's not to do with an economic recession, and that's not plausible.
Well, I think a bigger problem with the way this debate is sometimes framed is the idea that it's the government's role to create these jobs. I think you have to remember that at its most central, a job is a voluntary exchange between an employer and an employee. Now, when I looked at this problem, I spoke to hundreds of employers and hundreds of job seekers up and down the country, and one thing that employers were crying out for, what they really wanted to see, was evidence of the right attitude, someone who's willing to, who has work experience, someone who's shown and proven that they're willing and able to work. And they didn't really mind so much what that job was necessarily. They were willing to train up on various skill sets. What young people were desperate to do, as I said at the start of this piece, was show employers what they're capable of. And I think that's what these work experience schemes are about, fundamentally. The idea that it's the employer's role to somehow magically join these two groups together. They have to want to get together, and I think that's the bit that work experience schemes are trying to, that's the gap that work experience schemes are trying to fill.
Pierre, what do you feel about the issue here, about the sort of ideological kind of surround to this debate? Do you feel that people who are on these schemes are in some way being demonised in the political lexicon of the country?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, when you've got the likes of Rupert Murdoch's evil rags talking about us being lazy, I'd just like to make this point. I mean, basically, I actually worked out one week that I'd done over 70 hours of activism and 10 hours of commuting. I am in no means or by any means lazy. I actually want a job. I've been self-employed most of my working life, and that is part of my problem, because employers look at it and go, oh my God, we've got somebody that's been self-employed, and they can think for themselves. Before you know it, we'll have more members of our staff thinking for ourselves. Another point I'd like to raise here, John, Basically, there's 2.5 million people unemployed. There's 1.4 million people that are working part-time that want to work full-time. That works out to be another 700,000 people on top of the unemployment register, if you want to play statistics. And also, there's an awful lot of people that have signed on and then realised that it's more trouble than it's worth. They've got enough savings so that they don't actually get any benefit out of the benefit system. And so they actually sign themselves off because it's not worth the hassle. So there's far more unemployed out there than you would actually ever realise by just looking at government figures.
Manj, do you think that's the case, that there's a level of disguised unemployment in the economy at the moment?
Well, the TUC itself has estimated that there's actually 6.3 million people either looking for work or looking for more work. Now, if you put that in the context of 500,000 vacancies across the whole economy, then actually you're looking at over 12 people chasing every job, and that's without people changing jobs who are in work already. So it's just not feasible. I mean, I thought it was quite interesting what Deven said about it's not the government's role to create jobs. Well, that's actually a shift we've seen over the last 35 years, because actually since the end of the Second World War until actually the late 70s, the government did see its role as creating jobs. They had a policy of full employment, not necessarily creating them themselves, but ensuring there was full employment. And the government stepped back from that and said, it's not our role anymore, let the market decide. It's, like you said, Deven, a voluntary agreement between employer and employee. And let's see what happens. And ever since that period, we've had unemployment higher than it's ever been in any of those 35 years from the end of the Second World War till 1980. And
well, it is the government's role to create the conditions for growth. So I'm not saying that government abdicates all, has no role to play here.
It's all failing at the moment, isn't it?
Well, it could be doing the economy is crying out for growth. So I'm not disguising that fact, but actually employment has been rising and unemployment has been falling over certainly the last few quarters. So I think those are interesting. I mean, I'm not saying they're doing a fantastic job, but they are. It could be an awful lot worse, certainly compared to what people were expecting a number of years ago.
That's true.
Well,
I mean, I think I think what's interesting there again though is actually what we've seen is people's pay be driven down, and actually workfare is part of that because it undermines people's wage bargaining. Why would Poundland employ somebody even on £6.19 a minimum wage when it can get somebody from the job centre to work for free for 3 or 6 months or whatever? You know, so it does undermine that. And part of the reason why a lot of employers don't want to recruit is not because they don't think unemployed people have got the right attitude. It's because they aren't making enough profit at the moment. They're just simply not profitable. They're having to cut staff and lay people off because their profit margins are going down. You know, private companies are there to make money. That's what they do. You know, rightly or wrongly, that's their raison d'etre. If they don't make profit and increase that for shareholders, they're not going to survive.
Of course.
So but when you see wages being driven down and people's hours being cut, which has actually minimised the level of unemployment, I agree, then actually that's still harming the economy because the amount of money from the economy going into people's wage packets has gone down, and that's what we've seen. Falling living standards impact on business. As well.
Of course, private companies are here to make money. If they weren't making money, there wouldn't be any jobs. So I think you just have to accept that. That's actually
not disputing.
It's in many senses a positive reason for being. I think what some people don't recognise is if you've got a placement of 4 weeks or 6 weeks, it's not that there isn't any cost associated to that with the employer. And it's not even as though there isn't any benefit associated with that to the employee. So I think my understanding is with the Poundland example, for example, through the work experience scheme, 20% of those people got jobs with Poundland, which I think is not, there's an interesting point there. And we always focus on the negative aspects, and I make no excuses in the case of Kate Riley. Clearly she was motivated, as are the vast majority of people who are seeking jobs. But I think in this case, we focus too much on the negative examples of when these schemes go wrong, rather than perhaps when they do make the difference and actually help people into work.
Are there any overseas examples of these kind of schemes that have been successful?
More generically, I think it's employers across the world want someone who can. There's a recruit for attitude, trained for skill type paradigm within employers. So actually, if they can see, if you've got a job, if you know people who are in work, and you can build your job networks, then across the world, yes, that helps you to find that helps you to find work in any country.
What do you make of those statistics? I mean, Deven's saying there's 20% are successful. I suppose you could read that as 80% aren't.
You could as well, and actually what I'd do is look at the DWP's own statistics, which they published just a couple of weeks ago, which showed actually only 2% of people have found permanent work as a result of these schemes. The government's own modelling shows that if the work programme in its full, all the schemes combined, hadn't existed, you'd expect more than that to have got jobs anyway. So it's failing by its own measure. The target was 5.5%, it hit 2%. For disabled claimants, it was even slightly lower than that, so it's really not succeeding on its own terms. And it's interesting you raise the international model of this, because the DWP, before it introduced this, which was actually under a Labour government in 2009, we shouldn't forget, it was the Welfare Act driven through by James Pennell, but its own internal research in 2008 looked at these schemes in Australia, Canada and Australia and found they didn't work. Their own research told them, they published the papers and said it's very ineffective, especially in weak labour markets. And at the moment, we've got a very weak labour market. So it's really a policy that I think is wrong anyway, the mandatory element. I think it's been brought in at the wrong time, even by that standard, and it's showing. You know, the failure of the scheme is quite clear. I mean, the court case is obviously a separate issue, but actually on its own statistics, it's not working. It's not working as the ministers intended. It's not working as the DWP hoped.
Pierre, how great do you think the kind of pressure is on people to go on these schemes? In other words, how widespread do you think that the court ruling might be? How many people out there do you think could bring a case like Cat Riley brought, that says essentially I was told this was mandatory when it's not, I was pushed into this, I wasn't given my full rights, that's what the court decided was wrong here. Do you have any estimate of how many people on these schemes could make that kind of complaint?
To be quite honest, I don't, John, but I do believe that it would be in the hundreds of thousands. And I'd also like to point out that actually participation in the work programme is totally obligatory unless you don't want any benefits. Now, basically, you have no choice whatsoever but to join the work programme. I tried desperately hard to get away from it because I required training to turn myself into an electrician, and then I could go off and basically find my own work. Now, as soon as I joined the work programme, that chance to do that was taken away from me straight away. I did then attend a training course, which I was actually abused by one of my instructors, and basically I'm still fighting that at the moment. I'm fighting Ingeus, I'm fighting Norfolk Training Services for a Freedom of Information request, which they've been delaying and playing bureaucratic ping-pong with me. And I've had nothing but basically, I mean, how can I put it? Some of my advisors have been very nice people and been very helpful. But to be quite honest, the vast majority of them are nasty bullies. And it's just institutionalised bullying as far as I can see. I'd also like to point out that more people have actually been struck off of benefits via the work programme than have actually found jobs in the first place. So it just, it's not working, and basically all they're doing is lowering the number of people that are signing on just by chucking them off the dole. Brilliant.
I mean, Deven, that's quite a devastating statistic, isn't it, that there's been more people chucked off the programme by losing their benefit than have actually found jobs. I mean, presumably that isn't what you've got in mind. No,
that is an absolutely devastating statistic. I think what I'd say is we've got a benefit system that's been broken for a really long time. We've got a benefit system that's been almost solely about payments to people rather than about the people themselves and supporting the people themselves. And actually, I think a lot of what this government's trying to do is shift that culture away from a benefit system that's purely about payments and processing payments to one that's more about people and supporting people into work. Now, that's going to take a really long time, but I think things like changes that are coming in, like the universal credit, which actually makes sure that people keep more of their earnings from work as they move into work, ideas like the work experience scheme are all steps in the right direction that are about fundamentally supporting people into work. Now, around that, you also need a culture of support that's there to listen to the stories of someone like Kate Riley, who explains carefully that she's got work experience elsewhere. Well, okay, well in that case, this work experience scheme probably isn't appropriate for you. How else can we help you? That's the kind of service you want from, and I think that is the direction that the government's trying to take this in to a large extent. There is a problem with rhetoric here, but I think there's also a problem of rhetoric around a culture of low expectations. Ultimately, it is the individual that is responsible for finding a job and staying in a job. That's my point around voluntary exchange. It's not That's not something the government can control necessarily.
But is it? I mean, that's the point here, isn't it? I mean, the total number of unemployed, 500,000. Total number of vacancies, 500,000. Total number of unemployed, 2.5 million. So even if everybody who's unemployed now was given a job, or everybody who there was a vacancy for was given one of those jobs, there'd still be 2 million people who's, presumably you can't conceivably argue that it's their fault they haven't got a job. They just aren't there.
I think.
I mean, in other countries, when you've got 25% unemployment in Spain, or 56% youth unemployment, there's no point in saying 56% of young people just aren't willing to work. I mean, it's beyond belief, isn't it?
So we are crying out for jobs, we are crying out for growth, but at the same time, unemployment is falling. There are job opportunities available. It's just that the competition for those jobs is that much higher, which is, I think, is why schemes where the government does support people into getting the experience that they need to show employers what they can do are so important, so that they actually stand a chance of getting some of these jobs in the first place. If you've got no experience and you're up against a level of competition that much higher than there was before, well, actually, you're really going to struggle without that extra help, without being given the opportunity to show employers what you can do.
Well, there's a real problem there. I mean, I graduated in 2001, and that was actually, since 1979, the point where unemployment in Britain's was the lowest. I didn't know that at the time, but I've looked it up since. And I was quite lucky, but it still took me 4 months from graduating with a 2-1, from a fairly decent university to get a job. And I was on an unemployment benefit for that time, and thankfully I came off it just before I hit the 12 weeks where you have to widen your job search. And yeah, the work schemes didn't exist in the same way then, but I would have had to widen my job search, and not look at degree level things. Now, for graduates coming out who have now got, 3 or 4 times as much debt as I had, which I'm still paying off, by the way, and should finish next year. It's much, much tougher. And this has always been the case. Graduates have always come out, or people have left school at 16, at 18, and not had work experience. But we've never had this big problem. I mean, youth unemployment is at a record high. Admittedly, it's come down slightly. And some of that is about massaging the statistics, because people on these work schemes are actually taken off the unemployment statistics, which is completely false, because they're still getting a JSA, Job Seekers Allowance. So there's quite a bit of dishonesty going on here. And even if unemployment has come down by maybe 100,000 in the last 2 years, that's so infinitesimally small as to be really irrelevant. And I think when you talk about it's people's attitudes and having the right attitude to work, this isn't about people's attitudes. I mean, as John said at the beginning,
it's about showing and demonstrating to employers, because actually employers,
a lot of these people are perfectly demonstrated. They've written hundreds of job applications, they've gone to dozens of interviews, and they haven't got work because there just simply aren't the jobs. What this is about blaming the victim of the recession here. And of course, I'm not saying it's your position, but certainly the government is doing this. Of course it is. It's this whole strivers versus skivers. The thing George Osborne said in the budget about you get up and you see your next door neighbour with the curtains pulled because they can't be bothered to get up for work. That is such an infinitesimally small part of the population that doesn't want to do any work.
The rhetoric here
and
is
that's abusive. And of course, if you dehumanise people, if you abuse people, you make them seem other, and you can cut their benefits, you can cut welfare, and it's much more socially acceptable to do it if you've made these people sound like they're the architects of their own misfortune. To believe that, in the space of 3 years, an extra 1 million people were unemployed just because they suddenly lost the right attitude or felt a bit lazy is just, it's just nonsense economics. It's just not what happened.
Coming towards the end, what do you think the government should do to save these schemes? They've been damaged by the firms pulling out, they've been damaged by this case. What should it do to save them?
So there are 3 things here. One, the rhetoric isn't at all helpful. So I think one thing is to change the rhetoric from the strivers versus skivers narrative to one of actually higher expectations of people and of employers as well. So that's the first thing, the government to change the rhetoric. The second thing is for individuals to start to... I'm
afraid we're going to have to leave it there. I know you've only got through one of the 3 things you do, but at least viewers heard that. I'm sorry, that is all we've got time for. I hope you'll rejoin us for future editions of the Politics and Media programme.